Yeah, I'm very happy that we are going to listen again to Stephen Cave and Kanta Dihal and their closing keynotes on imagining AI, how the world sees intelligent machines. And just to remind you, Dr. Stephen Cave is Executive Director of the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, Senior Research Associate in the Faculty of Philosophy and Fellow of Hughes Hall at the University of Cambridge. And in addition to his research and writing, he has served in the British Diplomatic Service and advised a range of governmental and international bodies on the issues relative to AI. Dr. Kanta Dihal is a Senior Research Fellow at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, University of Cambridge as well. And she is leading two research projects, Global AI Narratives and Decolonizing AI, in which she focuses on the portrayals and perceptions of artificial intelligence across cultures. She is the co-editor of the great book AI Narratives that I mentioned before, and has also advised the World Economic Forum, the UK House of Lords, and the United Nations. Please, Stephen and Kanta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Xenia, and thank you, Alexandra, also for having us at this fantastic event, which we've really been enjoying so far. So we're just going to start sharing our screen. Hopefully you can see that now. So as Xenia mentioned, we work at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, or CFI for short, which is a collaboration between the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, at Imperial College London and Berkeley in California. But we have many other partners around the world, and you'll be hearing about some of those in this presentation. We're a very interdisciplinary research center. We look very broadly at the ethics and impact of AI. We have 5 different programs, some that look much more like conventional responsible innovation ethics programs, one looking at the relationship between biological and artificial intelligence. And the one we're going to talk about today is called AI Narratives and Justice, and that looks at questions of social justice and the imaginary of AI. So this program developed from a project that I started together with the Royal Society, the British Academy of Science, in 2016 called AI Narratives. And in that original project with Kanta and Dr. Sarah Dillon, we investigated portrayals and perceptions of AI in the English-speaking West. And this resulted in a report for the Royal Society that you can see here on the left. That was from 2018. And the book that Xenia has been kind enough to mention a couple of times, AI Narratives, A History of Imaginative Thinking About Intelligent Machines. And in this initial AI Narratives project, we were looking, as I say, at the dominant narratives around AI in the Anglophone West, how they stereotype the technology itself, and those who build it, and those who are affected by it. And we started with the Anglophone West because it's the tradition that we know best, and because it is, of course, disproportionately influential. It's the cultural sphere, for example, that pervades Silicon Valley, and so disproportionately shapes the technology itself. And as we've already heard at this conference, unlike many other new technologies, AI arrives with millennia, literally thousands of years of expectations, shaping the technology's development and deployment and reception. And through this long history, these narratives have not only influenced the public at large, but also shaped the expectations of those who grew up with these narratives to become the AI researchers of today. And as I'm sure you all already know, these narratives have some deep problems that we have examined in this project. I'll summarize some of them briefly. From the start, our project has really focused on the portrayal of intelligent machines as anthropomorphized and correspondingly as gendered and racialized. And first, the mythological and imaginative tradition that leads directly to current conceptions of AI is quite different to the imaginary of other technologies. Intelligent machines have never been portrayed as mere tools. They've never been just extensions of the human body or mind. They've always been agents, and as such have taken on human roles, such as servant or soldier, and correspondingly been anthropomorphized. But not just these kind of mechanical jobs like servant or soldier, but they've also taken on social roles and relationships as friend or lover, child or parent, and so on, which inevitably positions them within complex social hierarchies. But at the same time as taking on human roles, they've not been entirely human-like. They've always had various dimensions exaggerated and others flattened. The machine soldiers are hyper-masculine, machine lovers are hyper-feminine. They're supposed to show initiative and intelligence and agency in fulfilling their roles, but at the same time to be unthinkingly loyal slaves, which of course creates a great deal of tension, which we were discussing in the round table on utopia and dystopia. But I just mentioned the term slaves, robot slaves. Of course, the idea of robot slaves is a highly racialized one, but intelligent robots are very, very rarely coded as racially black or as people of color. Indeed, on the contrary, they're overwhelmingly portrayed as white, both in color and ethnicity. You can see that here. This is just a standard search. We've searched. This is intelligent robot is the search term. You can see at the top. You could do artificial intelligence or just robot or so on. You'll see the same. This is reflected also not just in stock images, but in portrayals in film and literature, in actual robots that people make, and so on. This very predominant whiteness. This is a phenomena that we explore extensively in our paper, The Whiteness of AI, which we published last year and to our amazement got press coverage around the world. But in this paper, we examine the way in which AI is used in the West to create, if you like, a white utopia, one in which people of color are almost completely absent, and the consequences that this has for public perceptions and for the implementation of real AI technologies. So this is really a very brief overview of our work. So this piece of work focuses on stereotypes about the products, the machines, the intelligent machines themselves. But these narratives and stereotypes also perpetuate and exacerbate expectations about the creators of these products, about AI scientists or developers. So, I mean, on the one hand, dominant AI narratives in the Anglophone West are literally the product of the white male imagination, in as much as it's mostly white males who create these imaginaries. But at the same time, inside these imaginaries, in these stories, AI is the product of white men. Even in our imagination, AI is a product of the white male imagination, if you like. So that, of course, plays into the whiteness of AI that we were just talking about, but it also plays significantly into what we might call the cultural construction of the AI scientist or engineer, which is very much as a white male genius. And I'm sure you all know that the field of AI, the sort of actual scientific and engineering discipline, has a diversity crisis. It is predominantly white men. Women are underrepresented. People of color are underrepresented. And if we see the whiteness and maleness of the stereotypes, the cultural construction of the AI scientist, I think we can understand both why women are put off from entering this field, why they find it difficult to enter the field even if they want to, and even if they succeed in entering it, why they face a great deal of skepticism and persistent hostility in the field. And we right now are just nearing the end of another project analysing a very large corpus of some 1,500 films, about 10,000 TV shows, to look at the portrayals of AI scientists and engineers and how they're gendered and racialized. And we hope to be publishing that later this year. So this is obviously a very quick overview of some of the themes that I'm sure you're familiar with from the kind of Hollywood hegemony over AI narratives. Are there alternatives to these stories? Is it inevitable that we imagine intelligent machines this way? I think there are persistent themes that cross cultures, but there's also a great deal of difference. And so when we thought it was very important to take a comparative approach to examine how different religious, linguistic, philosophical, literary, cinematic traditions can help us to better understand the Anglophone Western narratives and indeed provide us alternatives. And to tell you about that, I'll hand over to Kanta.
Yeah, so this is why we set up the Global AI Narratives Project in 2018. And that project emphasizes the narratives outside the English-speaking West, including narratives from countries that have AI technologies imposed on them from outside, and countries that identify themselves as rising AI superpowers. So in this project, we've convened a series of 20 conferences on AI fictions around the world. And that series moved online at the start of the pandemic. Through those workshops, we've developed a global network of people who work and think in the field of AI narratives in the broadest sense. So I will just give a few examples of the kinds of things we've learned in these workshops. And one major theme that we've encountered is that AI, as a technology of hopes as well as of fears, has been used to promote a vast range of ideologies. So we've held workshops in Russia, China, and the Czech Republic, so that means we very frequently encountered narratives of AI in a communist context. Soviet narratives about artificial intelligence presented ideas of trustworthy AIs in the service of humanity, starting with Ivan Efremov's Andromeda Nebula from 1957, which explores a communist utopia in which AI acts as a logical arbiter and decision maker that is mediated by human oversight. And those kinds of narratives of subservient or assistive AI influenced people's perceptions of early real AI in the 21st century in Russia. So until the 2010s, really, what people wanted was what they described as a terminator in the service of mankind. So they demanded, for instance, of chatbots that they must know everything, not have any emotions, perform commands, answer questions, and nothing else. And only very recently that view has changed. People nowadays don't want those stereotypical 20th century movie AIs anymore. They want much more fallible and likable chatbots that don't pretend to know everything and that can make small talk. And equally central to those Russian AI narratives is the concept of the Russian soul, which underlies the notion of a Russian national and cultural identity. So questions of what it means to be human, whether an intelligent machine could be considered human by virtue of it exhibiting traits that evidence having a soul, were therefore closely related to questions of what it means to be Russian. And the book on the slide, Elektronik, which has also been turned into a TV series, is one example aimed at children. In another Soviet film, the most important test for the AI to prove its humanity was whether it could drink vodka with a bunch of other humans. Now, in China, following the Chinese Civil War, which ended in 1949, science fiction literature primarily served a political role that was very heavily influenced by its Soviet counterpart. So it aimed to popularize science and to promote the country's socialist future. So it featured stories about artificially intelligent machines built to solve problems, to take care of the elderly, to teach children. And so in these stories, autonomous humanoid robots are helpful and obedient servants to their creators. And then a few weeks ago, we had a workshop specifically on narratives of AI behind the Iron Curtain, focusing on Central and Eastern Europe. And in the post-Stalinist era, cybernetics was seen as a means to break away from the hard labor and the suffering that defined the Stalinist era. So it was an opportunity for an egalitarian and post-work world. So that was the 20th century AI utopia, seen here through a communist lens. But in other countries, we found ideas of what the 21st century AI utopia could look like. So in Singapore, governance and technology are very closely intertwined. Technology is a part of the dominant official utopian visions. And that follows a tradition of imagining the island state of Singapore as a potential utopia. And that's a tradition that began with the British and was continued by the Chinese invaders and settlers. But Singlit, as Singaporean literature is known, tends to be dystopian. And its specific function is to provide an alternative to the narratives promoted by the government. Other kinds of utopias we found in Japan and South Korea, where we found that narratives are much less concerned about, say, automation-related job loss than those of the UK and US, and they're also much less concerned with themes of robot rebellion. And they tend to portray intelligent machines as friends, helpers, or reliable extensions of humans, instead of potentially murderous, rebellious others. So our attendees at the workshop noted that this was at least partly influenced by a different philosophical tradition, which emphasizes connectedness between kinds of entity, so between humans, animals, machines. And finally, in these countries, there is a concern with keeping up with or catching up with other countries, particularly the UK and the US, which they perceive to be ahead. So, for instance, in South Korea, that's been a particularly strong sentiment ever since the British company DeepMind beat the South Korean GOAT champion Lee Sedol. I want to end with the idea of artificial intelligence in a post-colonial context, and how the connection between being post-colonial or decolonizing AI is particularly frequently emerges in narratives about AI in the global South. So as our example there, we focus on the Middle East and North Africa. So on the 23rd of June, actually, we will be releasing a report at the UN on AI narratives in the Middle East and North Africa, titled Imagining Intelligent Machines, a Middle Eastern and North African Perspective. So our work there really had a strong focus on these post-colonial and neo-colonial aspects of AI technologies and perceptions, with many local contributors claiming that Egypt was, as we later summarized, an AI desert, with a very strong perception that there was no significant development of AI technology ongoing in Egypt, nor that there were any films or literature or non-fiction works stemming from the region that portray a future with intelligent machines. So there was a very strong sense in most of the MENA region that everything was being imposed from the West or from Japan. But then contributors, particularly from the Arabian Peninsula, showed that there are certain nations who are developing their own hybrid of Western technologies and stories with local approaches. And one example is the Ibn Sina robot pictured here on the slide, which speaks Arabic. But not everyone is equally happy with that hybrid, and some criticize it, calling it self-orientalism, which is using Western technologies with aspects that the West would consider typically Middle Eastern. So a robot wearing a tobe and a khufia, or having science fiction stories that may feature AI, but also jinns. Now, our most important takeaway from 5 years of researching AI in fiction is that the extreme and homogeneous narratives that are dominating the Western discourse are not the only way to imagine a future with intelligent machines. They have been dreamt of across the world in very different and in many ways more constructive ways. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for this wonderful synthesis. I cannot stress enough how much we admire this project of global analysis of AI narrative. Its scope make our own work very modest, and hope we can contribute to it with some French insight. Thank you, really. I thought before starting this conference, it was the very first one. In fact, you had 5 years of advance, so you got all my admiration. Maybe we can have, even if we are late, we can have a few questions now.
Question: do you have data about Italy?
We have, so we showed you the cover of our book AI Narratives. We also just saw one of our contributors, Kevin Legranger, pop up. Hello, Kevin, and thank you for your fabulous contribution to that book. So we are currently working on a sequel to that book called Imagining AI, in which we will have a chapter on Italian AI narratives by Eleonora Lima.
Thank you. Well, more seriously, I was very interested in everything you said, and especially the part about Singapore. And so I was wondering if you were working with universities down there.
Yes, we are. So we in Singapore we are working with both the National University of Singapore and Nanyang. We actually held our very first Global AI Narratives conference in Singapore back in late 2018, wasn't it?
Yeah, in fact, it's worth emphasizing that all of our workshops are that in everything we've learned, we really owe to fantastic local partners that we've worked with around the world. And part of what we wanted to do, there is a normative dimension, if you like. Zhenya was kind enough to mention when she introduced us that we've spent time, as I'm sure many of you have, advising various bodies on AI and participating in the global debate on AI, which actually tends to be very dominated by voices from Europe and North America. And part of what we set out to do was also to bring some of these academic communities from around the world into this conversation. So we have worked with partners in Singapore, but the American University of Cairo, for example, was our partner for the Middle East North Africa report that Kanta showed, and many other fantastic scholars around the world.
Yeah, so in most cases, our collaborators were universities. In one case, in Russia, our collaborators advised us to organize our conference there independently from any universities in order to be able to have a lot more opportunity for free speech and for open attendance from a wide range of participants. So in that case, we worked together with an NGO.
It's the vodka.
Which also nonetheless meant that there was someone from the Russian Secret Service attending our conference, so that was interesting.
Oh, interesting.
But yes, in all cases, we have aimed to have very interdisciplinary workshops that in which we work together with academic and non-academic partners.
Well, thank you. Anyway, I'm very admirative as well. It is such a seminal work, and it will really set the agenda for the future one. So and help us a lot. So really, thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very kind.
We have a few questions. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen and Kanta for the presentation. Well, the truth is that I agree with the other attendants that the project it's amazing. My question was related to a methodological topic. It's like how do you gather those narratives in the workshops? How do you do to collect them and especially not being super biased by the attendance, no? Because I guess that it's super hard to have an empirical approach on such abstract things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to be systematic in a satisfying way. But I mean, in particular, Kanta's team of research assistants put a huge amount of work together with our local partners into preparing each workshop and finding a wide range of participants. And of course, we're very dependent on those initial partners for advising us on the kind of sectors that should be represented, the kind of perspectives that should be represented. But I think we don't want to seem naive about the complexity of the narratives and their contexts in these regions. I mean, these regions are enormous parts of the world, so we recognize that we're only just touching the tip of the iceberg, and hopefully sparking conversations and creating communities that will continue to explore.
Yes, and also our approach in this was very much qualitative, based also on experiences we had when we initially started the AI narratives project, so that the more Anglophone West-oriented one. Because when we started this in 2016 for Stephen and 2017 I joined, we knew that there were individuals around the world who had been working on related topics but had never been brought together as part of such a body of work before. And so it was very much an approach of seeking out individuals and through their knowledge finding connections, and they might know individuals, and that really helped us just sketch out the field that we are working in. And it's only now that we have a much better sense of if we want to do quantitative work, what our parameters and approaches should be. And that's how Stephen and I are now with two colleagues in gender studies working on, as Stephen mentioned, our analysis of the gender of AI creators in film.
And perhaps unsurprisingly, the ability to really delve into the narratives of a given region is very dependent on the density of scholarship in that region, which, as you can imagine, reflects the general global distribution of resources. So in North America, we have people like Kevin, who's here, who's been researching this for many years or decades. And in other parts of the world, of course, there isn't anything like the same density of scholarship as we find in, say, North America.
Thank you.
Kevin?
Yeah, hi. I had a quick question. I've been really interested in my more recent research and writing about pragmatic aspects of AI, especially job replacement, replacement of humans in jobs. And, you know, there are narratives about that go back to the 20th century in Western literature, like Rossum's Universal Robots and Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin. But I haven't seen much of this kind of concern in other parts of the world. I wonder if you had encountered that kind of worry or not. Are most other regions of the world sort of more enthusiastic and not too worried about job replacement?
Well, we did find in many parts of the world that is much less of a concern. So, I mean, with Japan and South Korea being the most utopian in that approach, which is also quite closely connected to the demographics there. So this week it was on the news that Japan this year had set a new record low birth rate. Of fewer than 1 million babies being born in the entire country in the year. And so with an extremely rapidly and intensely aging population, AI being seen as potentially the only way to deal with such an aging population. But we also saw in India there is a strong underlying narrative of concern and the idea that steps must be taken now in order to prevent things going very badly wrong. So with quite, in some sense, extreme political stances being taken up about the role of AI and of any automation technology in the 21st century. And how it's going to integrate into Indian society. So on the one hand, there is a complete resistance against self-driving cars. So self-driving cars have essentially been dismissed before they're a thing, just because it would mean that so many, and that runs into the millions of people who would lose their jobs. Whereas in other cases, automation technologies are introduced, but the humans are not dismissed. So you get these very interesting sort of service-oriented jobs where there is a machine that is able to do a thing, but the human who wants a service does it via an intermediary human, so that there is essentially someone operating the machine for you, the ATM or the ticket machine for you, so that that person doesn't lose their job. So that is a narrative combating the automation-related job loss that I haven't seen anywhere else.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds similar to the United States proposition of creating more co-working robots, cobots, to help with human jobs rather than replace humans. I'm not optimistic, but thank you for that answer.
Can I just add, because Kevin, I know you've written, very insightfully about the anxieties about loss of control, and the long history of that in relation to technology and how that influences AI, and the sort of slave narratives and so on. And I think that plays into Western narratives about fear of obsolescence. In stories like, I've forgotten the author, but there's a wonderful short story called With Folded Hands, where the robots do everything and they do it so well, there's nothing left for the humans to do but sit there with folded hands. Or WALL-E, the wonderful Pixar, I think, film WALL-E, which shows a sort of dystopia in which robots do all the work. In both of those, there's a sense of humans have become not only obsolete but impotent. There's nothing, the robots have effectively wrested control, and it's impossible to take it back. And whereas I think in Japan, for example, that theme is almost wholly absent. There is a sense of robots and AI being completely reliable tools, or if they're more agential, then friends, but not as rising up against us. So I think these narratives interplay.
Interesting. Thanks very much. Very helpful.